viewers and listeners, welcome to the latest episode of Extra Extra. It's all about whiskey. I remain your host in the past tense. my mind is already racing ahead to where we're going with this episode. So I am your host, Jason NPH Johnson Yellen. He is Joshua Morrissey Hatton. Each episode, hello Joshua, so confused. Each episode of Extra Extra, we bring a whiskey-related news story to the attention of the other, and to our listeners, and to our viewers. We cover it, we riff it, we summarize it, we comment, we editorialize. We generally have a whiskey industry chat about what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And this episode, because it is our tradition, when we need somebody who knows things, we reach out to Jessica Rabbit Lomas. And here she comes. Hello! How you diddly doing?
Hello. You say know things. I think what you mean is gets grumpy about things. That's really what you meant to say there.
Well, anytime we want to see somebody who has seagull art, we reach out to Jessica Rabbit Lomas.
Not one seagull, not two, thrice seagulls.
Three's the magic number.
3. And the one in the middle, whichever way this points on my camera, the one in the middle is a seagull which is hanging out in the Pacific Northwest.
So the one in the middle, it's I look at it, I can't tell if it's smiling, I can't tell if it's serious. It's kind of like the Mona Lisa of seagulls.
Man, our listeners are loving this. So this episode, as our title suggests, Cask Whisky Association launches. And periodically, things happen in the whiskey industry where it's the first thing we talk about when we're in meetings with one another. We receive emails from whiskey friends, texts from whiskey friends. A lot of chat happens behind the scenes before we even get to the point of having it on Extra Extra. And so the launch of Cask Whisky Association has been one of those stories. Right away, last week, so somewhere in the 20s of September, we started receiving links to a Spirits Business article. I am quickly calling it up so that I can say that was authored by Georgie Collins on the 21st of September, a name that we are familiar with. And this article started to put out details on an executive board, an advisory board. There was going to be an association that was looking after the cask investment market. I know there's a major thread that I always think of when the cask investment stuff is going down. Joshua, I know there's a thread you think of when cask investment is mentioned. And Jess, I know there's a component of this that is a go-to for you as well. If I may just kind of lead out by saying my main thread here has been, when will the Scotch Whisky Association step in to all of this cask investment that is beginning to give the industry a little bit of a black eye? Questions are being raised, concerns are being voiced. Who's in charge of this? Who's giving this a rubber stamp? Who's approving? Who's the authority? And they haven't done it. The SWA has not stepped up to fill this void. And I feel like CWA, the Cask Whisky Association, has filled a void left by the SWA. And so my very first question for each of you is, do you view it in the same way? Do you view it in a different way? Perspectives. Joshua, as my regular extra partner, I'll come to you first, and then we'll follow up with young Jess. Dear Jess.
Yeah, I think, oh, geez, I want to choose my words wisely here because, if I'm being honest, there's some people within the CWA that we're quite friendly with, that we've done business with, that we're friends with, etc. But it seems that, yes, the Scotch Whisky Association has left a hole that the CWA has filled, but should they be the ones to be filling that hole? And I think that the answer is no. But I'm going to take it back a little further. When anybody who's read the article, and I urge everybody to read that article, and I think there's a subsequent Forbes article that the both of you have read that I've not
George
read yet.
Koutsakis wrote a pretty good piece on that.
George
I'll reference. I'm
Koutsakis,
sure
there
Jess
you go.
will reference as we go through this episode.
Yeah. And my concern with the CWA. Well, first off, I like what they led with, and they're leading with the idea of consumer protection, which on the surface, that's something we've talked about for a while, because it harkens back to the old cask investment schemes of the 80s and thereabouts, that really ruined the lives of a good number of people who have invested into casks and lost a good number of their monies. So that's a good thing. Let's protect the consumers. The problem is there's no mention. I mean, there is a mention in the article about the protection of industry, of bottlers, but when how should I say this? I'm going to say something you guys don't like. I'm going to say a nice thing about the U.S. three-tiered system.
Even a blind squirrel finds a nut once in a while.
But
everybody's sitting down listening to this, I hope. And if you're driving, please don't crash our cars. Just pull over safely. Just park while Joshua explains this incredible
hear me
point.
out, right?
Please.
The U.S. three-tiered system is put in place to ensure that an importer cannot own all the tiers of the system of getting bottles onto a shelf and therefore claim all of the margin, therefore monopolize the margin from anyone else, therefore artificially affect pricing to increase their own margins. So an importer in some states can have a distributorship, but they can't have a retailership. Or in some states, they can only be an importer and nothing else, right? Or there are protections in place. And what I'm seeing here is there's no delineation between someone who can be a cask broker and someone who can also run a cask investment company. And when you allow someone who can run a cask investment company to also be a cask broker, you can't trust that someone, and I'm not saying this about the people on this board, I'm just saying sort of writ large, there needs to be regulations in place where if you separate the two, you can ensure that someone sitting behind their desk doesn't say, you know what, I can make a bit more money on this cask if I put it into the investment market than I can selling it into traditional industry and sell it for traditional industry prices. So I think what there should be to protect not just the investor, but also industry, is a separation of an organization that could be a broker and an organization that can be a cask investment firm. This way, there's no bleed. This way, there's no chance of harming either side, or less chance of harming either side. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think that's very controversial, and possibly, to my mind, maybe making it a little bit more complicated than it already is. I like where you're coming from, and I see why you're coming from that, and maybe perhaps why that sort of style hasn't come out of the UK, because I guess a lot of this news has come from UK sources, and we don't really deal too heavily with the 3-tier system. It's over there somewhere. So I can see why maybe perhaps.
Okay.
That's not a view I've heard before, especially
Let,
not
let
when
me let me
entitled
throw
"It's
this
like the
example out,
three-tier
and I'm not
system."
going to use any names whatsoever. Okay. Last year, speaking to a shop owner who does special casks for their shop, was trying to get a cask of a certain 25-year-old whiskey. And the price was given to them, and it was exorbitant. It was ridiculous. And they say, well, if you give me that price, I will have to charge X on my website, and no consumer is going to pay X for this price. And that broker told that shop owner, well, I can just sell it into the investment market for that same price. So it's up to you. If you want it, I'll sell it to you and it's yours, or I'll just sell it to them and make the same margin. So that, I think, really affects industry in a bad way. Why should that broker be allowed to do that? It doesn't help industry. It only lines the pocket of that broker. If the broker didn't have the ability to sell it into the investment market, then they would have to work as the industry would normally work, which has been the way it had worked for decades and decades and decades. So that's why I really think it could be a system that could work. I understand that it's complicated and it hasn't been done. However, it doesn't mean it shouldn't be done just because it is more complicated.
So I hear what you're saying about the idea of a broker or somebody
Mhm.
who has some of this liquid in some place, offering it potentially to a store, and a store owner, a retailer, feeling quite unfairly treated. That's not a particularly nice statement from a broker, being like, "This is the price, and if you don't pay it, I'm selling it over here." Like that's not a nice way to behave. And this industry is pretty small, so my knee jerk reaction as a retailer would be to make sure I never use that broker again. But there's a tiny part of me, and this comes with a
Mhm.
lot of asterisks, so don't come for me. We live in a free
Mhm.
society, some could say a capitalist society. And if you decide to say to somebody, "This is my price, either take me at this price or I can sell it to an investment company, another retailer who's happy to sell it for top dollar, somebody who just really wants a cask of whiskey for a huge overinflated price," something like the CWA isn't going to stop that happening. They're not dictating market prices and market values. What the CWA is forming is a gang of happy-go-lucky misfits who have a little shiny brownie badge that says, "We're one of the good guys." So we probably wouldn't do what happened
Right,
to that
but
guy in the
okay, so
example, but
I understand you've got other views that we need to bring up, and Jason has views that he needs to bring up. My last comment to that is there's a difference between capitalism and a monopoly, and I think that we are verging on a monopoly here when someone is allowed to service both sides of the business, both investment and industry. And it wouldn't hurt to separate the two. You could still have capitalism just without the monopoly. That's all.
I'm with you. And I think my response to Jason's question about when you hear talk about this kind of thing, how do you feel? My initial thoughts are this remains a very underregulated market. Yes, to be involved from our side of the fence, there are lots of licenses, lots of bits of registration you have to have with the revenue in the UK, lots of rules as a company we have to comply with. But as a private individual who is walking down the street, I mean, that's a as a private individual who's scrolling through Facebook, if I'm honest with you, and is getting
Mhm.
endless results. Like I've been looking at this for a couple of days, and when this announcement was made, so my Facebook and Instagram algorithms are absolutely riddled now with hundreds of these gas companies being like, "Hey, come buy these things from us," which are some of which I'll get to in a bit. I think, the lack of regulation really shocks me. The idea that you get these adverts in
Mhm.
your, social
Yeah.
media feeds, or more frighteningly, people coming to you being like, "Hey, I've heard It's a really good idea to buy this. And that happens all the time, partly because of my job, our job, but because I run a whiskey tasting group and because people know what I do for a living, I get these fairly unsolicited emails of people being like, "Hey, I'm being offered a cask for this much money. Should I buy it? Is
Yep.
it a good investment?" And I have a copy paste response, which is, "I'm not a financial advisor. I'm not backed by anybody. It's your personal money, and you have much bigger pockets than I do. 15 grand on a cask might not be a huge amount of money for somebody who's looking to park some of their huge piles of cash somewhere. 50 grand is an awful lot of money to me. So my approach to this kind of thing is going to be very different. So the idea that there's no regulation, that you just rock up at somebody's office or you fill in a little form online and they ping across a very sexy laid out brochure with lots of these words like exit strategy, managed portfolio, diversifying your investment. These words, which to me fill me with dread, they all seem very big, complicated finance things. I can see why, if you're getting them thrown in your face all the time, eventually you're going to be like, well, this company that pops up regularly, they seem to know what they're talking about, right?
But that's one of the interesting things, and one of the quotes from Colin Hamden White in the Spirits Business piece, where he says, we're not really looking for a regulation like the Financial Conduct Authority, for example, but we do feel that there should be some regulation around advertising, right? Like he's already saying, we're not going to play in that sandbox. We're going to play in this sandbox over there. What's interesting in what you've just said there, Jess, is your response matches the SWA, which is, we're not financial advisors. We're not going to get into the market of cask investment. Do you think it's right for the SWA to be on the sidelines here? If that's your personal position, that's one thing. Do you think that should be the position of the SWA?
I think that's a very tricky question, and I am very conflicted, as I suspect a lot of the SWA lawyers are. So please, SWA lawyers, don't write the questions under. Because I think that's the point, right? The SWA exists as a body to keep the industry in order. Their job is to make sure that we're not producing whiskies that are popping up in another country and labeled as one thing. We're making sure that nobody is like, "Oh, this cask of whiskey appeared in my garden and now I'm selling it to very big online distributors," and to maintain quality and to make
Mhm.
sure that the definition of what makes Scotch whiskey, its very essence of what it is kept within some pretty strict order and kept to a standard. Nowhere in their day-to-day job is their involvement on a financial level. The SWA are not here to say, right, distilleries can sell to people. If you are in column A, your cask is this, and if you are a person in column B, then your cask is this. The SWA take no part in that. They leave that up to distilleries, brokers, people who are doing that. Rightly or wrongly, it's difficult because they've reneged a tiny bit. There is a tiny little kind of 3-page PDF, which I think Jason you'll be a fan of because it's PDF on their website, which talks
Thank you.
about
Thank you.
cask investments, but it doesn't really scratch the surface any deeper than make sure you've done your homework, check out company's house. Does this company look like a reputable business rather than a man with a Squarespace website and he runs it from the boot of his car? Not that it doesn't really go into detail any more than that. It gives a few important words, like if you're buying a cask, make sure you're asking for a DO, that's a delivery order, not an ownership certificate or some other fabricated words. The DO comes from the warehouse where the cask is. That tells you that it's definitely there and it exists. Beware of people promising you that you can have insurance for 50p for 100,000 years, and the cask, if it catches fire, you'll get, top dollar pricing for your cask. They didn't go really any further than that. I think the silence on their part is deafening. I think they don't know whether or not this is my opinion. I think they don't really know if they're in a position that they can come out and condemn this CWA as it stands, or if they can't exactly come around saying, "Well, look, lads, we've been really quiet for ages and we've had no opinions, but this, whatever this is that we've seen come past our
Right?
window, we don't like the look of that. Do it again." Like I sort of feel like maybe the time has passed for them to say, right, we're going to put together whatever some sort of form of a CWA looks like. We want these people involved, these companies, they're going to come together. This is what the structure is. But I think they're just kind of washing their hands, I suspect, watching closely. But I don't think you are going to see an SWA announcement anytime soon being like they are for or against
But
the
why
formation of
why
this
is it too late?
association.
Why can't they form something now for future protections? I don't think it's necessarily too late. I mean, yes, they are late, but it's not too late.
I'm not saying never. I'm not saying they shouldn't ever form an association. But I think some of it is that kind of classic stoicism of, we don't just not getting involved in it, just stand by.
But
This looks like a direct
meanwhile,
retaliation to what has been
and
formed.
I'm not trying to say bad things about the SWA. I think the SWA does a lot of things really well for the protection of Scotch whiskey. And there are certain things that trigger them immediately, like the distillery in Canada that happened to use the word Glen, and they're like, "Oh no, you don't. Don't you use that word?" But then when we run into situations like this, where we're saying, this could directly affect people's lives. This will directly affect the cost of Scotch whiskey, makes it unattainable for the masses, and can make product only available to those with bigger wallets than others. They're saying, well, that's just the way the market's going. That's not really protecting Scotch whiskey. It's kind of putting it up here, far away from the people who want to continue to buy it and explore it.
Yeah, I hear that. I just feel that an association needs to be made of an impartial, unbiased group of people who are not cask sellers. I certainly don't think anybody who is involved in this on any of the boards should be
Agreed.
financially
Yeah, yep.
benefiting from the sales made by casks. And even to some level, I feel like people who are benefiting by being bottlers, because I think you're still benefiting from the process of this somewhere. And I know Jason mentioned, and this is my opinion, very much chimes in with the Forbes article that you referenced at the top of the podcast by George Katsoukas. Sorry, George, if I pronounced your surname wrong.
Sorry, George. Yeah,
he's got, and I think we should share the link for this in the down below when
There's
we do
his
the
name, by the way.
at the end. And this article's really good.
Katsoukas.
There you go. That's how. Sorry, George. Okay. He's got a really nice kind of flow in his article where he, admits that he is also he owns a company selling casks, but explaining why he himself would never get involved in such an association because he is a biased opinion. And he's got a really nice little chunk here that I've got where he says that just like a student does not grade their own paper, a criminal does not choose their own verdict, and an official does not elect themselves, cask brokers should not be in any scenario self-proclaiming as protectors and advisors of the entire cask whisky industry. And I really think that's a much more succinct way of summing up how I feel about this. That I think you can't have people, and again, we're not talking about the individuals, but I think you can't have an association which is formed by people whose primary interest at the end of the day as directors of businesses, a director's aim is to keep your business profitable. And I think you can't have that hat on and then on the other side be like, oh yes, you seem like a fair and fit person, come on into the party. Because ultimately that's a conflict against the interests of your own company, I feel. And so to me, that's my problem with the foundation of this association. Yes, I think there does need to be something. I think it needs to go above and beyond just looking at how we advertise casks to regular Joes. But I do feel like it simultaneously doesn't go far enough, and it's formed entirely wrongly from the very beginning. So it's a non-starter for me. But I like the principle of it.
And on that exact point, let me bring in another quote from the article, which is, and again, it's Colin Hamden White, the chairperson. So Hamden White said that association members that have been vetted and approved by the CWA will bear a hallmark of its logo, allowing consumers and investors to know that they're a trusted source. So, in listening to you, Jess, you're saying, yep, we should have something that says someone is a trusted source. However, it shouldn't come from a group within, it should come from a group outside of that very industry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there are definitely key points we're hitting here that we're believers in. I think what's interesting is for Joshua and I and the number of extras we've done on Cask Investment, where I feel that we've been browbeaten by the investment companies, where we've now reached a point where we're like, okay, if there are going to be investment companies, they need to be trusted. Whereas our original argument was, no, there shouldn't be investment companies.
That too.
Like, we don't think whiskey should go down this path. And now we're like, okay, if you're not going away, we think you should be trusted at the very least.
Josh,
do you feel
Jess,
that way,
which
Josh?
one?
Jess?
Okay. Yeah. Listen,
Josh
All
and
of
Jess.
it.
should
Jess,
there be
whoever wants to
cask
take it.
investment? Yes, it's funny, right? The longer we ruminate on this issue, and now it's been an issue for quite a while. I feel like we've been talking about this for 2.5, almost 3 years, as it's sort of grown and grown and grown. My opinion has changed slightly in that, should there be cask investment? I guess there shouldn't not be cask investment, but I want industry to be protected and not affected. I want consumers to be protected. Period. There should be simple minimum protections in place. And there's a difference between protecting the consumer who's, it may be a difference in similarity as well, about the consumer who should be protected who is an investor, and the consumer who should be protected as someone who just wants to buy a bottle, someone who is able to go to the whiskey exchange and buy a 12-year-old Tomatin for 65 pounds, and now they've got to pay 85, 95 pounds for it. And it doesn't, people can't afford that these days, right? With inflation and recession and all this, it's both the bottle consumer and the cask investment consumer are significantly being affected.
So I'm curious what changed for you from there shouldn't be cask investment to, okay, if
Because
there's
I
going
don't
to be
think
cask
there's any
investment,
getting away
let's
from
protect
it.
investors.
I think it's just going to pop up. And if it goes away now, that's fine. It'll go away now.
Right.
But just fast forward another generation and it's going to pop up again. Everything is cyclical. Why not put regulations in place that can protect us now and protect us going forward? That's all. I don't think that there's any way of getting around it or away from it.
Okay, Jess?
Yeah, no, and I'm with you. I think you can't get away from now. It's too late. I think there's too many people quoting my hate favorite quote about the Knight Frank Index, which is a little bit taken out of context. It's the quote that everybody will have seen that says, whiskey is the best performing luxury category in the last 10 years. And then there's always a ridiculous quote that I think's like 548% or something increase in value, which, like, out of context is a fabulous number to throw about. I think actually the original context to that quote was actually to do with bottled liquid. It's got nothing to do with bulk stock. I have seen somewhere, which, as Joshua has just come to, bottled liquid is a very different kettle of fish, to mix my metaphors, to bulk liquid. I think what we're talking about here with CWA and about investments, I think, are largely looking towards bulk liquid, which is a totally different market to playing the games of buying bottles and using the F word, flipping them in auctions. Is very different. I think the absolute wildfire, and for me the most offensive part, is to do with these cask investment groups, because if you want to buy a bottle, And, ultimately we are independent bottlers, right? So we want people to buy our bottles. And if some of those bottles have gone into investment catalogs and portfolios, there's not much we can do about that, except at the end of the day, those bottles either go up or down in value. Somebody at some point, I would say, fairly high risk somebody's going to open these bottles. Especially the kind of things that we bottle, we are aiming for people to be drinking, opening, sharing, or the good wholesome content of the whiskey industry. But I think when you look at casks, there's a lot of pairs of hands involved here, most of which will never touch that liquid unless they are, pulling out the 100 ml samples that, some of these companies say you can take advantage of every year. You can do paper chases of casks, chains that go on. And, between me, you, the next guy, none of us has seen a drop of this liquid. It's a Schrodinger's cask, right? Does it even exist? Is it even liquid? And so to me, that's far more risky, because the cask is although they talk about a tangible asset, it's also a wasting asset. And as we know, casks can burst, casks can go missing, although, bad things can happen, and that liquid can end up on the floor of a warehouse, or the angels can have helped themselves to all of it because it's racked 12 high in a pallet. That as an investment, to me, I think it's never fully explained to the average Joe who doesn't understand the process of whiskey making, maturation, how it gets from being from that field where it's beautiful barley to in your hands as a bottled, beautiful bottle, single cask nation. The average Joe, there's a whole lifetime's worth of knowledge happening there. And I think the people that are seeing 548% return on your investment are like, brilliant, I'll put £10 in times 548% over a lifetime, and they don't understand that there's a whole chunk of stuff that can happen. And those are the people who I genuinely, and I say this frequently, need protecting. They are people who are looking to invest. And some of them aren't just kind of mums and dads with a bit of a pension pot. I get people who are very intelligent and have lots more money come and ask the same questions. I don't think it's necessarily about protecting people who are totally innocent to the process. I think it's because it looks really sexy and glitzy, right? Oh, I've bought 5 casks of whiskey, I've got 3 Bugattis, I've got 10 Rolexes. That's how we're treating all of these the same, and yet you're laughing because they're 3 totally different products.
Yes.
But in terms of investment, we're treating them the same. We're using words like portfolio manager, we're using exit strategies and management and diversification. But you can't control whiskey. Like, you could go and next time you get that cask regauged, suddenly it's dropped 5%, and our exit strategy, which said my 25-year-old another distillery was going to be blah blah pounds per bottle, which means that the cask is worth this. Oh well, suddenly it's 39.1%. Shit, it's not worth any of that. And I've waited 25 years possibly to maximize my 548% return.
Right.
And the phone call comes through saying, so that 15 grand you gave us as new make, which is a horrendous new make price, we could maybe swap it for another cask for you. And I think that's where we're going to get a lot of angry and disappointed consumers further down the line. We've seen it with people who bought those Bell's decanters as investment. And, they were promised these bottles were going to be their pensions. And I do still sometimes go into places where people tell me, that's the pension plan. That's where, the money's going to come from. And I kind of have to say, like, okay, knowing full well that realistically that decanter, unless it's one of the really rare ones, is worth less than 100 quid. And if it's one of the rare ones, it's £200 or £300. And yet these people thought these were going to be the shining beacons of the whiskey world. So do we need somebody to put together an association to help kind of weed out those cowboys from the real genuine players? I think we do. Even this morning when I looked at Facebook, I found within like 10 minutes of scrolling, maybe 3 or 4 cask companies offering me, and they all offered different amounts. One of them was offering me 20 to 30% return per year. And the lowest one, I think, was 8 or 9% per year. So even within 10 minutes of being on Facebook, like, look at the scale.
Yeah.
And you're just relying on somebody having a
Squarespace
website.
is awesome.
That's it. There's nobody ruling.
Yep. Jess, let me circle you back to a quote that you threw at us right before we hit record here, and we'll have a quick comment on this, and then we'll get out of here. To respect our tight 35, you sent a quote that was CaskNet said that an estimated 1.1 million of the more than 22 million whiskey casks in Scotland are owned privately rather than by distilleries. That's a gigantic number.
Yeah.
Is that number including, say, independent bottlers with their warehouses? We're not just saying 1.1 million casks are owned by private individuals, as in people sitting in their houses in Stonehaven, right?
It's really
Can you
popular
put
owning
some
casks
leaves
in
on the branches of
Stonehaven.
that quote?
That quote that I put
Huge.
across, there is no further context. It's interesting that you've asked it like that. I read it as the 1.1 million was out, using my dad's favorite Scottish word, out with the distilleries. That included people like us as indie bottlers, people that were cask investors, private individuals who
Yes.
obviously bought into distilleries who are starting up and have used that as a crowdfunding source. I took that to mean as like distilleries were kind of 20.9 million casks, and everyone else made up that little 1 point extra. But it would be interesting. I wonder
Exactly. Yep.
where that figure's come from. It was a new one to me. That's why I brought it to attention for extra. But I've not seen any further context to it, and I would be very interested to know if that means it's a figure that
If it's coming
there's a
from the
couple of ways that could go, isn't there?
distilleries or distillery warehouses, they could be treating any cask that they simply don't own as private to someone else, even if it's someone like a Gordon MacPhail or an Elixir Distillers that owns multitudes of casks to create large bottling runs or something like that. That's how it could be construed. So it'd be nice to find some leaves for those branches.
I would be interested. Yeah, I'd be interested to know if there's a way of measuring it. I think what CaskNet we're talking about doing is they're creating a digital cask register. So maybe further down the line, if they complete their project or are able to release results from it, maybe there would be some way of them telling us, okay, well, of that million or so casks, this percent are held by investment holdings. This is held by like you're saying, independent bottlers, people who are using casks for products that are not necessarily distillery producers. It would be very interesting to know how that breakdown works, because it definitely shows that there's clearly a fierce demand for casks, but that's not telling anybody who listens to this podcast.
Yeah,
or
I mean,
watches
someone
this
reading that
podcast,
can
something
think,
they don't know,
oh
right?
man, that's so many people investing in casks. That may not be the case. Yep.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Right. That's why I wanted the coverage and extras to say, no, they might be legitimately held by enterprises that have legitimately held casks for decades and lots of decades. So, all right, I think we walked a careful line through the CWA and the realities of cask investment. Our parting words always remain the same: be very careful out there. And if it's too good to be true, it probably is. If you want to drop us a note, questions at onenationunderwhiskey.com, info@singlecastnation.com. Also, you can drop us a comment either before or after you subscribe, before or after you TTB. You can let us know your thoughts on investment as well.
Indeed.
Jess, it has been wonderful having you along today.
Thank you kindly.
We always learn so much. Joshua and Jason, we three will get out of here
Peace.
the way that we always do.
Is it like this? Do you do like this? You say peace.
Peace.
Is that it? Did I do that right? I think it's this way. Okay.
Peace. 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 I think the word's important.